Hello and welcome to Discovering True Health, your weekly deep dive into health and wellness. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, please hit that subscribe button. It helps us out a lot and you'll stay up to date on all our upcoming shows. We also have a lot more great information on our website, Instagram, and Facebook. All those links are below. So today we'll be learning about a new technology in the biomedical field that is straight out of a sci-fi movie that will essentially put a body in suspended animation and make it possible to fix traumatic injuries that would otherwise cause death. It will dramatically help save lives of gunshot victims, soldiers on the battlefield, sudden heart failure, drug overdose, and accidents. Now, traumatic injuries from car accidents and shootings are the leading cause of death in people under the age of 45, and less than 5% of patients who suffer a cardiac arrest from bleeding survive. Now, this is because if a patient is in cardiac arrest, their heart will have stopped beating and they will have lost more than half their blood, and there are only minutes to operate, and it's not possible to get someone to the hospital in time. And in these cases, standard resuscitation techniques don't work on them for obvious reasons. So this is where this new technology called Emergency Preservation and Resuscitation, or EPR for short, comes in to save lives. So my guest today is Dr. Lynn Yaffe. He is co-founder, chairman, and CEO of the biomedical company EPR Technologies. And again, EPR is a new technology that will make it possible to fix traumatic injuries that would otherwise cause death. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here. Delighted. Nice to talk to you.
Now, I'd love to start with hearing a bit about your journey and what inspired you to focus your time and research on this incredible new life-saving technology. Was there some sort of catalyst in your life that inspired you to be part of this project? And how exactly did this incredible technology come into existence?
Well, I was always interested in research, even as a kid. In high school, I had a job at a laboratory, worked with white rats in the lab and did a few things with rats. And then my undergraduate training, I went to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, I majored in biophysics, and I was raised in Baltimore. And then after undergraduate training, I went to the University of Maryland Medical School, also in Baltimore. And then for postgraduate medical training, I went to Columbia University and did a residency in pathology. And all of those years, even when I was at Hopkins and in medical school and at Columbia, I was always involved in some laboratory work. And at Columbia, working there, I also spent time in a laboratory at what the time was called the Roche Institute of Molecular Biology. It belonged to Huffman LaRoche, and now I think it was sort of independent in those days, decades ago, but I think since then it's been absorbed into the company over in Nutley, New Jersey, across the river from Columbia University. So I would go there a few times during the week and did research in both places. And I stayed at Columbia and Roche for 6 years because I had signed up with the Navy to finish my training prior to being drafted near the end of the Vietnam War. There was a special plan that if you didn't do that, you could have possibly been drafted after 1 year of internship. But I signed up, I obligated myself for 4 years, and it's sort of as soon as I signed on the dotted line, they ended the Vietnam War altogether. But after 6 years at Columbia, residency and research, the Navy contacted me and said I had obligated service. So I came down to the Washington area and spent time at what was then called the Naval Medical Research Institute. And I got involved with combat casualty care research, aspects of that, whether it was sepsis, wound healing, blood research. And in those early days, the Navy sort of let you, follow whatever pathway you wanted to follow in general. I mean, more recently, it's a little more structured than when I started. And so I spent a number of years there, and it was sort of, they sort of gave you the money in a sense. And so it was easy to do research and easy to get the funding. And ultimately, they said I needed to spend some time away from the lab. And so I went to the medical division at the Pentagon. I spent some time at the Navy Bureau of Medicine and Surgery under the Surgeon General there. And then subsequently went to what was called the Naval Medical Research and Development Command, which controlled Navy medical research funding. And I was in charge of distributing a lot of money to Navy labs and to universities to meet what Navy medical research needs were. So in those years, it was around, let's say, 1992, 1993, I went to a meeting where I met a researcher by the name of Peter Safar. Now, in those days, it was always important in combat casualty care, as you mentioned in the intro, to save the lives of casualties who were killed in action. And if you look at Vietnam, and even if you go back as far as World War II or more recent wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, roughly 80% of US casualties killed in action who aren't killed instantly from a major head injury, 80% of those bleed on the battlefield. They bleed so quickly that they go into cardiac arrest and die. There's nothing that can be done for them. So the idea, and those are abdominal wounds or extremity wounds, they bleed out, called exsanguination cardiac arrest. And so the program for the Navy and the Army was to, what could you do for those casualties who died so quickly? And Dr. Peter Safar, when I met him, he had the idea, and he had discussed it with the Army, and he discussed it with me, and we decided to fund the project that he wanted to do, which at the time he called suspended animation, or temporary suspended animation, or also rapid profound hypothermia, which we now call emergency preservation and resuscitation. But I should back up for a minute and say something about Peter Safar. Peter Safar, in the late 50s, he invented mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He was a very great man, a great inspiration to what I've done since I've met him in 1995. And so I started working with him. He was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I worked with him from 1995 until he died in 2003 from prostate cancer. But when he invented really mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, there were some other techniques for inspiration. They would raise your arms or put you on your side. None of that worked. And it was only mouth-to-mouth that really oxygenated the blood in an individual who had undergone cardiac arrest. And he had associates. One associate was James Elam. So together they completed this. But because of all of that, and he integrated it with chest compressions. At the time, people were just beginning. And he wrote a book, first book then, called The ABCs of Emergency Medicine. A being airway, mouth-to-mouth. B being breathing. You open the airway, then do the breathing. And then C was chest compressions or circulation.
What year did he invent?
That was in the late 50s, 1960.
Interesting.
And he had Army money to do that. And then, he spent years after that popularizing CPR, which he called CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. At the time, also of interest, he was at Hopkins when he first invented mouth-to-mouth. And in those days, he was an anesthesiologist by training. In those days, anesthesiologists worked in the Department of Surgery, where today they all have an independent Department of Anesthesiology. Dr. Safar, in those early days when he was at Hopkins inventing mouth-to-mouth and integrating it with chest compressions, he said to the surgeons, we should have an independent Department of Anesthesiology. It's good to do that. It promotes independent research, and it's good for a lot of reasons. But Hopkins said no. But he had friends at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, medical school, and so he went there and started the first independent Department of Anesthesiology, and continued promoting CPR around the world. And in those days, there were no paramedics because paramedics didn't have anything to do without CPR, you know, and they were just ambulance drivers. And in the first few 1959, 1960, 61, 62, in Pittsburgh, the ambulance drivers were all white and they would not go into African-American neighborhoods. So what Dr. Saffer did was he took a group of unemployed African-Americans and African-American hospital orderlies, and he trained them to be the first paramedics in the world. And it was called Freedom House. And a Hollywood documentary was done about it. I mean, it's not available on Netflix, but I've seen it at Pittsburgh. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in Pittsburgh for what's called the Saffer Symposium and Saffer Lecture. And they had two of the first paramedics there, two African-American men. Their names were, last name was Moon and, God, I have a note here on it. John Moon and Mitchell Brown were the two guys. I still have notes on my desk from it. But they're in their early 80s. And so they were talking about the early days with Dr. Saffer and being the first paramedics. That was in days before 911 was the emergency call number. That didn't exist. So they said that once they got started, the police were aware of them, and the police were frequently called, not by 911, but by whatever numbers people used. And if the police dispatcher decided this was a medical problem and not, some police matter, the police would then call the paramedic Freedom House, and the police and Freedom House paramedics would meet at the scene. And if it was really for paramedics, they would deal with it. They would do mouth to mouth. They would start IVs. And obviously then, Peter Saffer championed training paramedics, and now you have to, go to school for it and be certified. So it's quite amazing. He was quite a pioneer. And his protege at the time was named Nancy Caroline, and she worked with Freedom House as well. And she went to Israel to train Israeli paramedics the first time. And in Israel, I forget the Hebrew name for the National Medical Emergency Services in Israel, but she's considered the mother of paramedics in Israel.
Wow.
It's interesting. But now in Pittsburgh, just as an aside, and interrupt me if I'm going in too long, they've started Freedom House 2. And so they're taking minority individuals who, haven't finished their education, and they're paying to get them to finish education, putting them through the programs, see if they can pass the test and become paramedics. If they can't make it all the way to become paramedics, maybe EMTs, maybe 911 dispatchers, maybe receptionists or something to assist paramedic services. So it's called Freedom House 2.0. And it's a, funded program. It's very interesting how Dr. Saffer's legacy is still carried on at Pittsburgh from, over 20 years now, since he died in 2003. And so the Army and Navy started funding Peter Saffer. And in those early days, they worked primarily in pigs, large animals. And a large pig is a good physiological model for human physiology. And what he did was, because you can't do CPR on the battlefield, the military was paying for all of this, he said, well, cool them down to profound temperatures. Because Dr. Saffer felt that at low temperatures, where the heart won't beat, you're not breathing, you have no brain waves, you have what's called ischemic tolerance, meaning your body will be fine for a few hours without any oxygen. So experiments were done in these large animals, and they were under anesthesia, of course, following, FDA and NIH guidelines. These animals were bled to the point where they went into cardiac arrest, sort of simulated trauma. And then they would try CPR for, a little while with, residual blood, and they'd be, have a nose cone to breathe for them, or they would intubate them to simulate mouth to mouth. But obviously they had lost so much blood, you couldn't get the heart started, and you couldn't give enough fluid. because they were still permitted to bleed. So at that point, they would do what the time they called suspended animation. With a large bore catheter, a large tube, they would put into the descending aorta, and they would rapidly inject maybe 2 liters a minute or more into the pig with ice cold saline, physiological saline, like they'll hang on a patient at a hospital. But this is like 1 or 2 degrees centigrade, just above freezing. And within a few minutes, that would circulate throughout the pig, getting rid of any residual blood in the pig, but it would cool the pig down to a temperature where they no longer required oxygen. And the pig was good like that. For a few hours, they could do repairs, and then they could give blood back and resuscitate the pig. So initially it was called temporary suspended animation. We also call it rapid profound hypothermia. Now that's hypothermia where in terms of human temperature, it's down to 5 to 15 degrees Celsius or centigrade, which is like 41 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So at that low temperature, profound hypothermia, there's no heartbeat. Your heart doesn't beat if it goes 3 or 4 degrees below normal body temperature. It'll stop beating. And of course, there's no breathing. So there's no oxygen, no heartbeat. And your brain appears, you have flat brain waves, but you have cellular life. Your cells are still alive, and they can remain alive at a cold temperature for a few hours. So that if you give back blood and start oxygenating again, your cells and the brain will be fine. And that was clearly demonstrated in large animals and small animals as a possibility. I should say that when we talk about profound hypothermia, below profound hypothermia is ultra profound, which is just above freezing. It's very hard to get to those temperatures. So through experiments, Dr. Saffer and the team showed that profound was good enough for a few hours. Above profound, you have deep, which is about 10 degrees higher. It's still very cold. And deep hypothermia is sometimes used in difficult neurovascular surgery, where they will put a patient on cardiopulmonary bypass in order to lower the blood pressure and the temperature of the brain so that difficult neurovascular surgery can be done and the cold temperature is protective of the brain. Okay, that's not profound hypothermia, it's higher, but it's still hypothermia. Above that is moderate, and above that is mild hypothermia. And it's important not to confuse mild hypothermia with what we do, which is profound. Now, mild hypothermia, even Dr. Saffer recommended 30, 40 years ago, but it hasn't come into vogue until relatively recently. So in heart attack victims who are resuscitated, like not everybody who has a heart attack dies, they can need CPR, or they may just have a heart attack and their heart continues to beat. But if they're unconscious and they don't become conscious immediately after they're given CPR or they didn't need CPR, it's recommended by the American Heart Association, and all major hospital facilities do it now. Their body is cooled down maybe 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. So 37 centigrade or Celsius is normal. They'll drop the temperature to 33, 34. If you go to 32, you run the risk of the heart not beating. So they just lower it a couple of degrees, and it sort of takes the pressure off of the heart's healing and the brain. It may not be perfectly understood, but the cold temperature is beneficial, and they'll keep you in a mild hypothermic state for maybe 3 days. And, you're kept from shivering and you're unconscious. And then hopefully all goes well when you're rewarmed. They do that cooling by body wraps that they circulate cold water through, and they usually monitor your temperature with a rectal probe or an esophageal temperature probe. Profound, of course, you can't get to that low temperature fast enough when CPR doesn't work. So you have to do it by injecting the cold saline directly into the aorta to get it throughout the body. So, sometimes I say to people, oh, we're doing something related to hypothermia. And they say, oh, well, mild, isn't that already done? Profound and mild, they both end in the word hypothermia, but they're two different techniques used for two different purposes. So people shouldn't confuse.
So EPR is profound.
Is profound.
And
rapid,
profound. And it's rapid. It happens quickly, and it's the amount of cooling. It's the amount of the degree.
The temperature that you drop the body to.
Okay. And just to kind of get an overview, so this is going to anybody that's bleeding out quickly from an accident or gunshot in the battlefield, heart attacks, you said it can also help,
Well, let's say for an older civilian population.
Right. And drug overdoses as well.
If a drug overdose, depending on which drug, and if it's fentanyl and you give Narcan, they'll start breathing again. But if you're slow with giving the Narcan, or their depression is so great that when you get to them, they're in respiratory arrest and you can't reverse it. Depending on the timing, and if you have the equipment, if you cooled them down fast enough, well, then you wouldn't have to worry about the lack of oxygen.
Right.
So really, in any situation where the brain is not getting oxygen for whatever reason, you've bled out, heart attack, you're a drowning victim. If your brain isn't getting oxygen, and your heart's not getting oxygen, you'll go into cardiac arrest. And if it can't be reversed, you're dead.
Right.
EPR gives you one more chance at survival by rapidly cooling you down. So a lot of things have to be in place for that to happen. Nobody's doing rapid, profound hypothermia in the field. We've just started the first clinical trial in the world a couple of years ago. And unfortunately, the clinical trial has been on hold because of COVID. The clinical trial is being done at Maryland Shock Trauma, which is a premier trauma center. And the physician in chief, the trauma surgeon in chief, is Dr. Tom Scalia, S-C-A-L-I-A, Thomas Scalia. He's like one of the, if not the foremost trauma surgeon in America and the world. He's certainly in the top 2 or 3. And he's a strong advocate of EPR. And our trauma surgeon who's in charge of the study was one of Dr. Saffer's proteges when I was there at Pittsburgh. He's become a full professor of trauma surgery and moved to Maryland Shock Trauma. So the clinical trial is being done there. It's an ideal place to do it. In the Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Spherus trauma cases are flown in by helicopter. And so, by the criteria of the study, which I can go into if you want, it's done there. But severe COVID patients who need to be on respiratory assistance, who are in respiratory failure, they're put on a machine called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, which takes blood. So when, at the height of COVID, when they had 100 patients, so much blood is diverted to save COVID patients. And in EPR, of course, during the resuscitation rewarming phase, we use a lot of blood. So they put our clinical trial on hold, and it hasn't quite restarted yet. In Maryland, they still have 50 to 60 patients a day inventory, same patients, maybe some die, some new ones. In the hospitals in Maryland, every day is the inventory of COVID patients in the ICUs. It must be 250 in the hospital in general, but ICUs, it's around 50 or 60. And yesterday in Maryland, they still had 11 COVID deaths. So, it's elderly people who for some reason didn't get vaccinated, or they have some, immunocompromised position. I'm sure it's probably similar in California. It may be bigger, but I only track what's happening in Maryland. But
right.
So
now let's how exactly you kind of went through it with the pig. How exactly does the process work?
Right,
Putting the body into suspended
right.
And
so
what happens kind of physiologically? And
right.
I think you said there's a catheter put in.
Yes, I'll go. What's done for the human clinical trial, even though it's on hold, a few patients have been done, and they did a quick press release that someone was put in suspended animation and they was resuscitated. The FDA doesn't like preliminary information going out, so the clinical trial is ongoing. it's on hold right now, but I hope it'll get started very soon as COVID comes under more
That was
control.
I think I read 2019 was when they did the.
Yeah, it was in late 2019.
Okay, that was the
That's
first
right.
human that was put through.
That was put in suspended animation for 3 hours. And it's quite amazing. But what's done for the clinical trial, so the trauma surgeons know when the patient went into cardiac arrest. You don't want someone out in the field who the paramedics get to. They're in cardiac arrest, and the paramedics do CPR while driving them back to the hospital. The paramedics do a great job. But for a clinical trial, you want to know when they went into cardiac arrest. You want to know how long CPR was done by the trauma surgeon. So the clinical trial is only done on trauma victims with no apparent head injury, who are like 18 to 62, I think. They don't do elderly. And they have to go into cardiac arrest at the trauma center. And then they do routine CPR for 30 minutes, 40 minutes. They intubate them. They don't do mouth to mouth at that point. They can intubate them and mechanically breathe for them. They'll do chest compressions. And they got a team there, so it's not one person doing it. And they get very good CPR. Sometimes people are worked on who haven't lost a lot of blood. They do CPR for 30 to 40 minutes and they'll get them resuscitated. But our patients, they've lost so much blood that once they go into CPR, the chances of getting them resuscitated are very slim to zero. And then they're, as a last ditch effort, they'll do a left thoracotomy. And a thoracotomy is where the camera, I can never know which side is which on the camera, but they open the left side of the chest where your heart is. And then they will manually, with a gloved hand, massage the heart and continue to defibrillate. If they can't get your heart started, even though they may have put tourniquets on, may have abdominal bleeding, they've done everything conceivable. They'll open an envelope to see whether you should get EPR or whether you're a control who will be permitted to die. And that's because the FDA, in experimentation, they demand controls in an initial study. It seems a little crazy, but it's not. And so if the patient is going to get EPR, because the chest is already open, they'll put a large diameter, like the size of your finger, into the top of your descending aorta, which is the large vessel coming off the left ventricle of the heart. They'll also clamp the lower descending aorta with a clamp so that the cold saline they inject through the catheter first goes to your brain. Because of the coronary vessels that come off of the aorta, they cool your head, they cool your brain, and because of the carotid vessels, they also cool your arms. But they're not cooling your lower spinal cord, your liver, your kidneys, or your lower extremities. Once the brain reaches target temperature, they'll then open that clamp to cool the rest of the body. All of this takes place in 7 minutes,
And does this replace all your blood? Does the saline replace your body?
You probably lost most of your blood anyway, but the cold saline, the physiological saline, flushes out the remaining blood.
Okay.
And you're on a table, and they are able to dispose of that. It's not spreading over the trauma room floor, so to speak. So they monitor your brain temperature using what's called a tympanic membrane thermistor. A thermistor is sort of an electronic circuit resistor that's very sensitive to temperature changes. So it's a sort of an electronic way of measuring temperature, and they put that up against your tympanic membrane, and they know through research that's a good way of monitoring your brain temperature. They're not going to stick something directly into your brain. They may put something in the esophagus to monitor, but first thing is brain temperature. Once your brain temperature gets down to, 10 degrees centigrade, you're good to go. Your heart's cooled down, your head's cooled down. They cool the rest of the body, within 8 to 12 minutes maximum, usually around 10 minutes. They take you at Maryland Shock Trauma, they take you to the room next door. They open up your abdomen. They do whatever surgical repairs on your extremities, your abdomen. They stop the bleeding. They do the essential surgery. I mean, whether you might need some subsequent surgery later on, as a lot of these trauma victims have survived too. So then they've closed up all the wounds. Then they put you on cardiopulmonary bypass, which is a routine thing. They hook it up to an artery and a vein, in, let's say your arm or wherever they want to do it. And then that machine gives you blood back, and it returns blood through a vein. So as they do that with a lot of blood, they flush out the saline. Okay. And they're giving you blood back under that controlled situation. And at the same time, they can start to warm that blood so that you're no longer at 10 degrees as the temperature slowly goes up. Once your heart temperature gets to 33 or 34 degrees Celsius, it will spontaneously start to beat. Okay. If it doesn't start spontaneously, they'll do defibrillation. So they get your heart started and you resuscitate. Now, whether you're going to survive or not to leave the hospital depends on what your initial injuries were. I won't go into the medical complications from trauma. Let's say going into cardiac arrest is the biggest complication, the immediate one. EPR deals with that, gives you one more chance for the physicians to deal with all the other complications, whether it's organ system failure, sepsis, reperfusion injury. There's a lot of problems, coagulation problems, and they deal with those. And in one sense, those medical subsequent issues, you could say, well, that's separate from resuscitation, as was reported prematurely in that first patient, and maybe for some subsequent ones. EPR works. Whether you get to leave the hospital is a question of the severity of your trauma, or ultimately the severity of your heart attack. And so the clinical trial will get started. Any medical problems they'll deal with, and eventually people will leave the hospital. How many more patients need to be done in the clinical trial? That'll be up to the FDA after the initial group is done, whether they'll open this up so that other trauma centers can do it on a clinical trial basis. We don't know yet. The FDA does things very methodically, one step at a time. But the ultimate goal is to continue this to the point where we can make it sort of semi-automated so that a paramedic can do it in the field. Right. To make things portable for the paramedic to do.
So this would be, they could show up at a car accident and do the procedure immediately. And is there a period of time, like when somebody starts going into cardiac arrest or bleeding out, is there like a window of time where this needs to happen?
Well, the window of time is really based to the adequacy of CPR. Okay. In other words, theoretically, if your heart is being compressed and you have enough blood in your system that they raise your legs or whatever, they're giving you whole blood if they have it, which they don't have in the field. But you go into cardiac arrest. If they do good CPR, you're good for a long while. In hospital situations, sometimes they do CPR for 40 minutes, as I said. But in the field, they can try that. But the situation is so tense, so difficult. It's like 2 paramedics, maybe 3 at most. It's hard to do it, and it takes the paramedics time to get there. Right. It's not like in the clinical trial where you go into cardiac arrest in front of the trauma surgeons. There's a team's ready to deal with it. So, that's part of the future. It's hard to make predictions. But just as CPR took, several years to become the standard of care, EPR will take a few years to become the standard, hopefully the revolutionary standard of care. I don't want to make predictions over time, but there's no question that rapid profound hypothermia stops the immediate need for oxygen, so stops death, and you can be resuscitated and have one more chance. Right. In the United States, just in the United States, there are 500 to 550 trauma victims a day on average. Every day, that's from automobile accidents, that's from motorcycle accidents, that's from, unfortunately, shootings, mass shootings, manufacturing, industrial accidents, falls, the whole range. And the trauma victims, in that 550, the serious trauma victims that go into cardiac arrest because of their injuries, at best, 5% of those get resuscitated. So it's almost like they all die. If you're a sudden cardiac arrest victim because of an arrhythmia or coronary artery disease, if you're out of a hospital and that happens, and you go into cardiac arrest and the paramedics come or a bystander's doing good CPR, only about 15% of those survive. So there's still a large number. In a hospital, if you're going to have a cardiac arrest, the best place to have it is in a hospital because there 40% survive. So, there's still a number that don't get to leave, even if they're successful in CPR. That 40% that's successfully resuscitated, they don't necessarily go on to live normal lives. So, the numbers are difficult, and, exactly what will happen in the future. It's difficult to predict, but for sure, EPR works. And the important thing, it gives you or a loved one more chance, is Dr. Scalia at Maryland Shock Trauma, I have a quote where he said, he's tired of telling parents there was nothing more we could do. Oh, he wants to be able to say, well, we did EPR. It's still touch and go, but at least we got their heart started and we've closed up their injuries. It's in this most recent horrific event in Uvalde, Texas. While the police, whether all the facts are out yet, but supposedly were waiting outside the room for an hour. Some of those children bled to death. They probably, if gotten to a trauma center, they could conceivably have survived. Or if EPR was available, maybe EPR could be used. So it's something that's going to be important in the future. And the EPR team is dedicated to that. That's our goal. You could say in memory of Peter Safar, because that was his goal, to make it a reality for the future.
Right.
So it's a little bit of science fiction, a little bit of reality, and a little bit of we'll wait and see what happens in the future. So, to move things along, because we're sitting on patents, it costs an awful lot to put a patent through. We started at startengine.com, which is a premier crowdfunding site. www.startengine.com/EPR-technologies. We've been raising money, not a lot, a little to get started. The more money you raise, the easier it is to raise more money. So we've got some high value investors now that we're talking to, that they usually wait till the last minute in order to put in. And some of them don't like to do the crowdfunding. They like to negotiate with the company and say, well, you're giving X number of shares if someone puts in $1,000, but we want this special treatment. So, but it opens the door, and podcasts also get the word out. So more people become aware of things, and that's the goal, is to get enough money to move forward and have more money, because to commercialize this, it takes money.
Absolutely. And it's really the next phase in CPR.
That's right. That's right. Well,
builds up.
The clinical trial is being done. And when it resumes, we want to have enough money so we can hit the ground running to get this started. All the research and all of the clinical trial has been paid for by taxpayers through the U.S. Army. It's all grant money to the universities to get this done. The government money, if it had gone through the company and then given to the universities want to be indemnified against any lawsuits. It's like if a drug company pays a university to do a clinical trial and something goes wrong, obviously it's hoped that doesn't happen. Well, then the university doesn't want to suffer the lawsuit. So usually it's the drug company can afford the indemnification insurance, where we couldn't do that, where if the money goes directly to the university uses its own insurance if on the off chance they were sued. So we take all our steps very carefully, and this is going to happen eventually.
This crowdfunding that you're talking about, there's a site we can all go to be involved, and there's a structure kind of for.
Yes, on that crowdfunding site, www.startengine.com/EPR-technologies. I got it here somewhere. I can hold it up.
Oh,
This
perfect.
This is, does it look correct? I mean, to me, it looks backwards.
We'll post it below so everybody can easily just click on it too.
But you can see it. So there's our website and the Start Engine site. And we've got, I don't know, 3 weeks left initially. And we've had small investors, about 93 small investors, who, I'll remain dedicated to. And it's opened up the door to talk directly with some high value investors and some foundations who hopefully are going to put us over the top, even when our crowdfunding ends, in order to make this happen. But on that site, if you go down to the end, and it, the terms and everything, I can't discuss. You have to go to the site. The SEC doesn't permit you to discuss terms in a podcast, because if you go to the site, you can read the history of everything and also all the risks. Every investment has risks. So all the risks are clearly stated. If you got to the very bottom of the lengthy page, there are updates, and you can see videos of Dr. Saffer, videos of him doing the very first mouth-to-mouth. You can see a video that was done about Freedom House and his role. You can see some magazine videos about suspended animation and EPR, and me doing some videos if you have an interest in looking at it. So I encourage everybody to take a look, even if they don't like the terms and they can't invest. It's interesting from a scientific standpoint. Eventually, maybe taking the body down just above freezing. Freezing can potentially destroy cells because you get ice crystals. Though people work on how to eliminate the water in cells with like an antifreeze solution, so you can survive freezing for years of suspended animation.
Right. And I was going to ask you that: is it a specific window of time right now that somebody can be in suspended animation?
Well, our temporary, we only take it to 3 hours maximum.
Okay.
But in the animals, you could go a little further, but we haven't tried for a month. If you go beyond 3 hours, you need to start being concerned about returning oxygen to the body. So then you have to start circulating an oxygenated solution, not just saline,
right.
Maybe some artificial blood or something, because after a while, whatever residual oxygen was in cells or whatever you've turned off metabolically, it can't stay that way forever. So we look at it as a limited time of 3 hours. Whether that can be prolonged in some suspended animation chamber by circulating a solution that gives oxygen, or whether you can replace all the water in the body with an antifreeze and then freeze them, and they're good for years. I mean, people do that kind of research or hibernation research because, there are Arctic fish that you can freeze solid. You can freeze them solid, and then you can thaw them and they're alive again.
Wow. So it's
possible.
It's
because they have like antifreeze in their blood. I mean, there's some insects that you can dehydrate. And then when they're rehydrated in the desert because it rains once a year, they come alive again. And so the human body is obviously more complex.
Right, but there is a possibility because
progress is being made. So,
because this is actually in nature, this idea of suspended animation, possibly in the future, we could use this to travel to far-off galaxies.
Exactly. I like following 4 things: resuscitation techniques like EPR, anti-cancer stuff. And there was that big, it was on the news about those 12 patients who were completely cured of their colon cancer. All patients in the clinical trial were completely cured using, excuse me?
I did just see something on that.
Yeah, that was very interesting, using what they call checkpoint inhibitors to unmask the tumor cells so your immune system can destroy them. So resuscitation, cancer, heart disease, obviously, and anti-aging. I'm fascinated by anti-aging research because I want to go on as long as I can.
Absolutely.
But they're making progress in anti-aging. It's companies like Google and I think Amazon, they started, research institutes in anti-aging. And now Saudi Arabia has decided that they're going to invest $1 billion annually into an anti-aging research institute. I don't know exactly whether it'll be, I mean, it can't just be in Saudi Arabia. They're going to have to fund people in the US, or where they establish some centers of excellence at universities. But the more money that's put in, the better. They're trying to, I guess, improve their image.
Right.
So they're taking over professional golf with their own golf tournament now and starting anti-aging. So I'm all in favor of it.
Yes, we want to live as longevity.
Right.
So it's health span and lifespan improvement.
Right, exactly. I have a friend whose mother is in good shape at 104.
Wow.
Mentally 100%. And I have another friend whose whose aunt, she's about 85, and she had an aunt that died a few years ago at 107. Amazing, isn't it?
Well, I've learned a lot about the blue zones. There's the blue zones, and where these groups of people are living, not just their lifespan, because their health span is they're 100 and whatever, and they're still sharp and completely healthy, and
it's really diet and exercise. Those are the key things. I mean, your genes are important too.
Right, but I'm sure we'll figure out technology as well, like information to, I mean.
They're flatworms. I mean, these small worms, they can increase their lifespan 5 to 10-fold by manipulating their genes. They manipulate genes that human beings have similar genes to the ones that they manipulate and increase the worm's lifespan. But, the worms aren't eating at McDonald's twice a day. So
we're not eating all our packaged. Right. Unfortunately, our food industry has decided that it wants to shorten.
The day will come. The problem is going to be you can't count on Social Security at 150.
That's a good point. That's a very good. And it's interesting you talk about all this, these different animals in nature, and how it's not sci-fi. It actually is in nature. It's a reality. There's fish that you can freeze. So that's probably where sci-fi came from. They know about these actual biological animals, and without those properties, and transfer those to.
And talking about nature without going on too far afield, but getting back to EPR, anecdotally, you may be familiar with, or listeners may be familiar with, a healthy skier is covered in an avalanche, and it takes the rescuers a couple of hours to dig them out, and they've cooled down quickly, and they're lucky enough that when they're rewarmed, they can be resuscitated and they're healthy. That doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened. Right. And sometimes a child, a baby, or an adult falls under one of the Great Lakes that's frozen over, and by the time the divers find them, an hour or two has gone by, and they're able to rewarm them and resuscitate them.
Yes.
Now, those individuals are healthy individuals at the time they're cooled down. We're dealing with trauma victims. But still, the idea of rapid, profound hypothermia in and of itself, allows you to survive without breathing, without brainwaves, without oxygen for a few hours and be resuscitated. Maybe not 100% of the time, but it allows you to be resuscitated, just like CPR doesn't work 100% of the time.
Right.
But now doing that in trauma victims is more difficult.
And just understand the principle of it and what happens physiologically. So basically cooling down the brain to that temperature, like you said, it flatlines the brain waves. So it's not sending the signals to the rest of the body.
And the cells don't need oxygen to survive.
Right. And do all your organs stop? Your kind of organs shut down? You said the heart stops?
Yeah, well, the heart stops beating.
Right. Okay. But the cells are still alive at this point.
The cells are still alive, right. If the cells were dead, there'd be no coming back to life.
Right.
So your brain cells are still alive, but you've almost made their metabolism requirements zero. Okay. Your liver, when it's cooled down, it's no longer metabolizing. Your kidneys are no longer producing urine, so to speak.
Right.
And so everything is cooled down, but there is cellular life, minimal cellular life. It's called ischemic, meaning no oxygen tolerance at profound hypothermic temperatures. In medicine now, there's the category of therapeutic temperature management. And under that is mild profound hypothermia, as I said, which is completely different than profound. Deep hypothermia, which neurovascular surgeons will do, in individuals connected to cardiopulmonary bypass, they're not trauma victims. And then profound, like we do. They're all different, but they all come under the major heading of hypothermia. So temperature management, there's a journal devoted, just medical journal devoted to that. And so it's becoming a subspecialty in a sense. They'll have teams at major universities. If you're at a university or even a regional hospital, and let's say you have to have blood drawn, the nurse usually doesn't draw the blood. Your physician doesn't draw the blood. It's the venipuncturist team comes in, they draw the blood. So now at major centers, if you get a heart attack victim who is resuscitated but remains unconscious, the nurse and the physician, they don't strap on the body cooling device for surface cooling. They call the mild hypothermia team. They come with all the equipment, they wrap you up, they plug you into the circulator, and they get it done. It's much more efficient that way to have a team, just like their trauma teams, so they're specialists in these things as it becomes more and more available throughout the U.S. In most European countries where they have much more, I'll use the term socialized medicine,
right,
but where there's national health care, I guess a better term, they're able to better enforce standardized care. So every medical center will do mild cooling in Europe, where there are probably some hospitals in the US where until you get transferred to a higher level hospital, they may not be prepared to do it because we don't have standardized care throughout the country. The only thing standardized is what Medicare pays, I guess.
Right.
In a sense, that's standardized.
Our system's all broken. So this after the procedure's complete, the warming up portion is basically just pumping blood back into the body that's warmed, and that's the procedure.
Right. That's the function of what's called cardiopulmonary bypass machine. So you're put on a machine that starts to pump blood and breathe for you.
Okay.
Because you're not breathing yet on your own and your heart's not beating. As they warm that blood, they'll put you on a respirator.
Okay.
Right? And they'll start breathing for you off the machine. And when you get closer to normothermic temperature, mild hypothermia, your heart will start spontaneously usually, or they'll defibrillate you and then the heart starts. It's really quite amazing. I remember in the large animals, once they're coming out of profound hypothermia, it's amazing to start the heart to spontaneously start, because that's what the heart does at the right temperature. It beats. That's what its cells do. So that's how. So then they'll take you off bypass, when you're breathing on your own, or usually you're intubated, but your heart is beating. Until they feel.
And then it depends on, like you said, what type of organ damage or what kind of physiological damage they had, if it can be fixed or not, but gives them a chance.
Serious things are organ system failure. I won't go into the details of that, but you get into situations where your liver or your kidneys don't function properly.
Right.
And, or what's called, you could have sepsis from the trauma, even though they may treat you with antibiotics, you can still get an overwhelming sepsis. You can get what's called reperfusion injury, which they give you drugs to manage, which is when your body hasn't seen routine oxygen for a while. As soon as the flow of oxygen goes, you make a lot of free oxygen radicals, a chemical derivative of oxygen that can damage tissue. So they have to deal with all of those things. And it's not easy in a severely traumatized patients, because right now the clinical trial is working on the worst possible cases. We don't look at it and say, well, let's do someone who's they needed EPR, but they're in the best possible shape.
Right. We got to make sure it works.
That's right. That's not how they do these clinical trials. Even like say if it's a cancer trial, depending on what's being tested, they may try it on the patients where every other treatment has been exhausted. They've tried everything. So there's nothing new to try on this cancer patient except for some experimental drug that is starting clinical trials. So they give that one last effort for that patient. That's why the news about the rectal cancer clinical trial was so amazing, with all the patients responding, going into remission. That never happened. So that's why they were so delighted, and they released that information, which may have been a mistake, because now everybody with a similar cancer and condition is going to clamor to get that treatment. Right. So that's why the FDA doesn't like those preliminary advertisements. So, and now I apologize for going on so long.
No, but you talk about your trials, getting back to your trials. So currently they are on hold because of the lack of the blood needed for COVID.
Right. Blood donation at hospitals have sort of gone down because of COVID. People are reluctant, I guess, to go to hospitals and donate blood.
Yeah, and so when do you have a projected idea of when the trials will start?
Well, I hope in another month, 6 weeks maybe. I hope not longer. The team is ready to go. Yeah. And we have another team trained in Chicago. We have the money. Chicago hasn't started yet because of COVID. They're trained to do it. So hopefully sometime, let me be conservative and say in the next few months, it'll get started again.
And once it starts, what's the
predict
time frame?
Because, they have to wait on, hopefully the clinical trial will be done in 6 months, 8 months, hard to be certain, because they have to wait for, let's say, the ideal trauma victim to come in.
Right.
Can't have a head injury, has to be in the right age group, can't have gone into cardiac arrest until they get to the hospital. The team that's trained to do EPR has to be the one that's on call, and they're not on call 24/7, and they can't spend the time or money training everybody to do it. So you've got to be in the right age group. You got to go into cardiac arrest. When you get to the hospital, you have to have no evidence of head injury, and you have to be lucky enough for the EPR trained trauma team to be the ones who are on call when you get to the hospital and go into cardiac arrest. And the clinical trial has to be not on pause any longer. Right. Other than that, if you go into cardiac arrest and can't be resuscitated, you're dead, as happens every day.
Yeah. Is there a certain amount of people you need to, like, how many different people do you need to go through this trial in order for it?
Well, they want to, approximately a dozen, maybe more. Yeah. The FDA looks at it as we go. They may extend the clinical trial with more patients. A lot of depends on the details of what happened during EPR, the surgery, how did the resuscitation go. So there's a lot of information they look at, short of, well, did they leave the hospital? I mean, that's the ultimate, but we don't expect that to happen, at least initially, frequently, because of the severity of injuries. It's just like in the early days of CPR. If the FDA had looked at it then, CPR probably wouldn't, it wouldn't have been as adopted as quickly. But times have changed in the degree of care and the degree of analysis that has to be done, And so it's hard to predict. I hate to predict. Right. If you go to our Start Engine website, I don't do any predictions. I just say it's ongoing. We have to wait and see. There are many risks. If you invest, you could lose your money, but consider all the facts. I mean, revolutionary things eventually happen,
Absolutely. And are you saying, so back when he developed CPR, there was no need for, at that time, it was different. We didn't need the FDA approvals. We didn't have this whole system. Was that kind of the difference?
Right. It was quite a bit different. That there was an FDA doing some things, but for that, they didn't seem to be involved. In fact, in those days, Dr. Saffer did mouth-to-mouth experiments on colleagues in the lab, if you can believe it. He would take his lab associates, other investigators, and with drugs like curare, they would paralyze their respiratory muscles. They would inject them, they would start an IV, they would paralyze their muscles. So if mouth to mouth wasn't done on the colleagues by Dr. Saffer, and you can see this in the video clips, 2 of which I have on the Start Engine site, they would have died. But they had such faith in Dr. Saffer that he wouldn't let them die. He did mouth to mouth while also looking up and speaking to the camera. Then he'd go back to mouth resuscitation. And then they'd give the antidote to the curare when they were ready to bring them out of that paralytic respiratory muscle phase. And the FDA would not permit that today.
No, I was just thinking that. I was like,
you
wow.
need consent forms and everything. You can't do it on an associate in the lab.
Right.
And so things have gotten, for the good, things are much stricter now.
Right.
But research takes time. I mean, if the
Absolutely.
initial cancer research in whatever the cancer is, they all failed, until they find the right drug. And now, immune therapies are all the rage. And I think that's going to save us from cancer. And genetic engineering and what they're doing with that, and what they did for sickle cell patients, the blood disease in mostly African Americans that causes their red cells to sickle and can be very painful, and they can die young. They took red cell precursors from those patients. They genetically altered those cells to correct the DNA defect. And the ones they've done are normal, right? And they're following them, but they're doing fine. So it's going to become the mode of understanding things. They've gone beyond just genetics to what's epigenetics. I don't know. Yes. You should get an expert to talk about epigenetics.
Just did a show. We just did a show on it. We just did a whole panel on epigenetics.
Yeah.
We had a doctor, we had a psychologist or psychiatrist, and then we had an Ayurvedic specialist, because Ayurveda is the oldest science in the world, and Ayurveda actually has epigenetics embedded in it, the principle of epigenetics. So
absolutely, it's fascinating how things get changed other than the exact DNA-based sequence, how it can be used to influence your prodigy.
Absolutely.
I'm sure there's still things they haven't discovered that'll be important.
Oh, yeah. And we were talking about how epigenetics and childhood trauma can affect us epigenetically in our DNA.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Generationally through epigenetics. I mean,
yes.
Incredible.
Yes.
So much.
And even the studies about starvation, that people who are starved, it creates epigenetic changes that can be passed on to their progeny and still have an effect.
Right. The doctor, he was mentioning a study that was done in I think it was a fishing village somewhere in the Netherlands or somewhere there, where they were lacking food, and that was passed.
Yes, I think it's a Scandinavian country.
Scandinavia,
yeah, it's fascinating.
It really is. I mean, we're learning something. I mean, DNA and epigenetics and what you're doing. I mean, it's really exciting. The future of medicines.
Absolutely. That's why I want to live for a long, long time, if possible.
Yes. We need smart brains like yours to continue.
Well, I don't know about mine. We need a lot smarter. Like Peter Saffer, I'm just a hanger on, making sure to continue it. But there's some incredibly smart people. It's amazing. And fortunately, Congress, even though they can't agree on anything, they usually agree on funding NIH, which is one of the benefits of most of the men in Congress being, or many of them in the Senate being elderly, that they want to fund research. So they can agree on that, which is good, which is very good for research. So they understand that. And it's amazing that they can continue to fund NASA, and the space telescopes, which is another frontier.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Your technology kind of in the future goes hand in
the future. It could be.
It could be. Suspended animation for.
We're not going to be going much further than Mars unless they find a way to hibernate people.
Yes.
In some way. Unless you have a spaceship big enough that you send a colony ship, and it's your great grandchildren who will eventually get to some other solar system. That's possible too, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that the website you talked about before. So if anyone watching or listening would like to find out more about the trials the technology of EPR and all those videos you were talking about, as well as the links to where anybody can be involved in the crowdfunding. That's the website that they can.
Right. You can go to the Start Engine site, which is www.startengine.com/EPR-technologies, or you can go to www.epr-technologies.com, our website, and at the very top it says like invest or something, and that'll take you to the Start Engine site. While the Start Engine thing is still open, and there are ways of contacting us as well, and our marketing guy, via LinkedIn and I think Twitter and
we have all the social media. We have information.
All those social media sites, right?
All that. So.
I think we're on all the sites except for TikTok, which
everybody on TikTok's looking to learn about suspended animation. So I will post links to your website and all your social media where people can find you and check out the videos you're talking about and the links. Before we wrap it up, do you have any final thoughts or words about the importance of EPR and the work you're doing?
Well, I guess in a nutshell, to sum up, EPR, in my opinion, in the opinion of my colleagues and uninvolved trauma surgeons, EPR is a revolutionary advance for the future. I mean, it's inevitable. It works in large animals, and it's been reported EPR, rapid profound hypothermia, has worked in some individuals. We do it in the worst cases. So, I think with progress, it's inevitable, in my opinion. And so we're trying to take a step forward at a time and be dedicated to the memory of Peter Safar, who started all of this and died 20 years ago. It all continues. So I hope to live long enough to see it become the standard of care. And that's the dream. And that's what I'm dedicated to as well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Christy.
So excited.
My pleasure.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. And thank you for the important work. Thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Work you're doing in the medical field that
I'll start checking out your podcasts regularly now.
Yes, please do. Remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about your body, the better you're able to stay healthy and prevent disease. And a quick reminder, I'm not your doctor. Please don't take this as medical advice. If you have specific questions about your healthcare, feel free to reach out to your practitioner. And if you like this video, please like and share with others. This information could really help someone you may know. And hit that subscribe button to be sure you don't miss out on our future shows. And I will see you all next Wednesday on the next episode of Discovering True Health.